Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you doing?
I'm very well, Michael. I've got a rather heavily panting dog in the background. That's not me, I promise.
Well, you can't sound worse than I did last night. I had my microphone the wrong way round, co-hosting for the entire show, which is very embarrassing. I apologise to our audience for having to listen to my tinny sound yesterday. Everything this evening is going to sound wonderful to the ear. And we have some great stories coming up. Rishi Sunak's new line of attack against Labour. It's pretty weak. We'll also give you the latest updates from the French elections. I've got a great guest coming up on that. And Starmer likes to say that he believes in a politics of service. He also seems to believe in a politics of free tickets to concerts and football matches. We'll talk about it later and discuss whether it matters. With less than 48 hours to go until polls open, the Conservative campaign is getting increasingly desperate. And they're falling back on a familiar ploy, Project Fear. This is the latest attack ad from the party.
Could not be reached for comment. Power cuts are expected across Britain throughout the day as the country is hit by Russia's energy cut-off. Our special economic correspondent has more information.
I think we're going to have to cancel the holiday. I know. We just can't afford it anymore.
So it's basically just an advert about the last few years of Tory government. We've got really record high inflation. Russia have cut off the gas, which means that our energy bills are up. You know, this is what happened under the Conservatives, right? Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. They've also got this sort of vision that Labour are going to come into power and the FTSE, so the stock market, is going to completely collapse. Sort of businesses are going to flee the country. This is a party. You know, I mean, we at Novara Media generally think they'd have been a bit too sort of pliant, let's say, to the wishes of big business. But there is no danger that under this Labour government, businesses are going to flee. The Financial Times are backing Labour. The Economist are backing Labour. They haven't backed Labour for a couple of decades now. So this idea that they can say Keir Starmer's going to come in and there's going to be complete chaos, I'm not sure anyone in the country is buying it. Also, they're really trying to hone in on Angela Rayner as being particularly scary. I'm not sure that many people in the public generally agree. However, while that video was particularly desperate, it didn't include the most desperate line the Tories are now resorting to. They're bashing Keir Starmer on the idea that he will be a part-time Prime Minister. So the attack is based on something Starmer said to Virgin Radio. So he told them this: "We've had a strategy in place and we'll try to keep to it, which is to carve out really protected time for the kids. So on a Friday, I've been doing this for years, I will not do a work-related thing after 6 o'clock, pretty well come what may. There are a few exceptions, but that's what we do." Now that seems like a perfectly unremarkable thing for a parent and a politician to say. And in fact, just 2 weeks ago, Rishi Sunak praised Keir Starmer for carving out time for his family, telling Nick Ferrari this.
Well, I think actually when I hear him talk, these jobs all take a toll on everyone's family. And I think he does a very good job of balancing, family life and work life and making sure that he prioritizes that and makes time for it. And I think when you hear him talk about that, that's a nice thing.
But in the Tories' desperate campaign, what was once deemed a virtue in Keir Starmer is now deemed a vice. The Tory Twitter account put out this tweet. They say, Keir Starmer has said he'd clock off work at 6 p.m. if he became Prime Minister. You deserve better than a part-time Prime Minister. The only way to prevent this is to vote Conservative on Thursday. And they've also mocked up their sort of faux calendar as to what Keir Starmer would be doing in his day. They say 9 to 10 a.m. cabinet meeting, 10 to 11 a.m. meeting with the unions, because this is a leader who's going to be in hock to the unions. Then he's got a 90-minute lunch, a meeting with Sadiq to discuss ULEZ expansion, then an afternoon nap from 3:30 to 5, a meeting with Rachel to discuss 17 new tax rises, and then Angela Rayner comes up again. Go home. If emergency, contact Angela. So he's saying that's from 6 p.m. If anything happens after 6 p.m., you can contact Angela Rayner. Grant Shapps has also waded in. He said, virtually every military intervention we've carried out has happened at night, partly to keep our servicemen and women safe. The British people will wonder who will be standing in for Starmer between 6 p.m. and 9 a.m. Angela Rayner, David Lammy, Ed Miliband. Defending Britain's security isn't a daylight hours only job. Now, what both of these ignore is Keir Starmer said that when possible, he will spend time with his family on Friday after 6 p.m. Right? And they've made this into a whole sort of 24 hours of attacks. This is what a party does when it's in deep distress. This was brought up on Sky this morning. So it was Maria Caulfield answering questions. She's a health minister.
How important to you is work-life balance?
It is pretty important, but I would say as a minister, it's not really that feasible. I note that probably what you're alluding to is Keir Starmer saying he's going to be doing a 4-day week and finishing at 6 o'clock every evening.
No, he didn't say a 4-day week. He said he was going to finish work at 6 on a Friday, like many people do. And I believe that's to help his wife observe her Jewish faith, which is commonplace amongst Jewish people. So not a 4-day week. That's not true.
Well, I'm a person of faith as well. And so the work-life balance is extremely important. But he has indicated that he wants to kind of have a more flexible working life approach. That's just not possible.
That's just not... He's indicated he might like to spend some time with his family on a Friday afternoon, which, by the way, is exactly what Rishi Sunak said he admired about Keir Starmer. Aaron, we are less than 48 hours away from polls opening, and this is really all the Conservatives seem to have, right? A load of attack lines that basically just apply to their government. So the idea that business have fallen out with them, that inflation is high, that we were reliant on Russian gas, all of this stuff is what happened under the Conservatives. They're saying you'll get that under Labour. People are presumably going to watch that and say, we got that already. And then the idea that Keir Starmer might want to take the afternoon off, not even the afternoon, that 6 p.m. is when 6 p.m. on a Friday, that's not a 4-day week. That's not working part-time. That's a full-time job. What does this say about the Conservatives and what does this say about Labour?
Well, it says a significant amount about the Conservatives. They are completely screwed. I'm sure everybody watching, listening to this can remember the photos from during COVID of the back of Downing Street at the end of work, at the end of the day. There is definitely an end of the working day at Downing Street. You could tell because people were having G&Ts out in the garden. So the idea that somehow they were all fastidiously working into the night, it's just complete crap. It's complete nonsense. The fact that it's happening, like you say, with 48 hours to go is instructive. This is really desperation. But also, Michael, I thought there was a little part of that attack ad, which was ridiculous, which I think was quite instructive. That was the person going, we're going to have to cancel the holiday. This is Sussex, Hampshire, Surrey voters thinking that they're maybe going to vote Lib Dem. They don't really mind Keir Starmer. They already think taxes are high anyway. Labour probably can't make them go up any further. Broadly true. And it's aimed at those people. It's aimed at the seats like Gillian Keegan, like Jeremy Hunt, home counties, southern Tory seats, also in the southwest too, all along the A30 corridor. The Lib Dems are going to make hay in these places. And by saying you could miss out on a future holiday because of the nasty Labour Party's tax rises, that's who it's aimed at. On the point of Starmer being lazy, this is really funny in a way, because you might remember, Michael, there was a portmanteau which grabbed the political imagination in this country about 15 years ago, and it was the word chillax, because David Cameron was described as the king of chillaxing. This was a man who installed a karaoke system at Chequers so he could croon away to ABBA and the Bee Gees over the weekend with his wife and children in tow. That is fine. It's a work-life balance. He is also somebody reputed to basically finish the working day at 5, 6 p.m. He's also reputed to take naps in the middle of the day. So you're absolutely right to highlight this double standard with the Tories, where they're saying things that is basically describing the last several years. But all of the things, almost play by play, that they're accusing Keir Starmer of is precisely how David Cameron, chillaxing Dave, governed this country between 2010 and 2016. And furthermore, their icon, Winston Churchill, Michael, used to take naps when he was the Prime Minister. He used to read late into the night. He would be drinking champagne and wine and whiskey and brandy at lunch. He would look like a giant baby, apparently, bathing in his bath quite early on in the day. He would sometimes even wake up with a bath. So on the one hand, they're saying this is the greatest Britain ever. On the middle hand, they're describing their own PM, their most successful leader, frankly, since Margaret Thatcher. And then Keir Starmer is nothing like this, but they're saying he's like those other two people. But apparently they're very good, and this other guy, he's very bad. Desperation, like I say, there's a slight bit of method in the madness because they're targeting those Lib Dem wavering Tories across the South. And that's not to win, right? This is key. Targeting those people is not about winning or forming a government. That's because they're worried about getting 50, 60, 70 seats. That's because there's polling out there that puts the Tories on a record low, but also 22 members of the cabinet lose their seat. That's what that advert is about. It's not about winning. It's about minimizing the number of cabinet ministers you lose come Thursday evening, Friday morning.
The desperation of the Conservative ads as well. I mean, the Labour Party and Keir Starmer's strategists will sort of put this down as a win. Sort of they'll say, look, we've got to 48 hours out of the election. And, we're the Labour Party. We're supposed to be very vulnerable in moments like this. The paper should all be attacking us. The Conservatives should be sort of hammering home, those scare stories about taxes. I mean, they are hammering home scare stories about taxes, but they're not landing. And they'll say, look, this is because we have given the Conservatives so little to attack. And I think that's true. I think fair play to them. They've obviously run a very successful election campaign. They wouldn't be about to win a gigantic majority if they hadn't. It's also one of the reasons, I suppose, why this election is so boring in a way. I think we're allowed to say that now because there's only 2 days left of it. I think that what's interesting about this campaign is the collapse of the Conservative Party and the fact that there could be this massive reconfiguration on the right of British politics. If Reform, overtake the Conservatives, that would be massive. If the Conservatives go below 100 seats, that would be massive. But in terms of the battle between Labour and the Conservatives, which is what an election is usually sort of focused on, I think it's somewhat dull because, people aren't really offering very much. Now, Labour would say that was always our plan and it's working. But I don't know, you seem to have a different perspective. You're not in any way tired of this election.
Well, I'm not tired. I mean, it's coming to its conclusion. So, it makes sense that you've heard it all. All the manifestos have been out. The attack lines have been repeated ad infinitum. So I'm tired of it in so much as it's coming to a conclusion. I don't think it's uninteresting. I do think there's this extraordinary gap between how the Conservative Party are behaving and the reality of what could happen next. You've said that, Reform could overtake them as a party of the right, the centre right. I don't think Reform are on the centre right. I don't think the Tories are on the centre right. But because of a two-party system, there is a party of the centre right and the right, and Reform want to overtake them now. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Reform will get a lower percentage, and I think they'll get far, far fewer seats. I think they'll be very much undermined by our electoral system. But I think if Farage gets in and they get, say, 5, 6, 7 MPs plus, and they may get many more, they could get 20, 30, but let's just say a handful of MPs plus Farage, and the Tories lose all their big beasts, and they maybe just have Suella Braverman left, right? I honestly think that in Farage's mind, he's thinking, right, he's not even going to bother with Labour, Michael. I mean, he will on stuff like migration and the sort of grand narrative, but in terms of campaigning, they will say absolutely every one of those Conservative MPs is like prey, and we are the predator, and they will track them down for the next general election. I think that's how they would look at it. So even if you had a situation where it's 80 Tory MPs and 10 Reform MPs, I absolutely think they would say we have the momentum, we have the drive, we have the resources, we have the media narrative behind us. We will replace them after that next general election in 2029 or sooner, probably 2029 or maybe 2028. So I think it's very interesting for that reason. Also, poll after poll, what we're seeing, Michael, is actually the smallest percentage for the two major parties combined since 2018. Now, in 2010, that was the case because, of course, you had this massive Lib Dem performance. They were already doing really well in 2005. Then Nick Clegg comes along, he bumps up by an extra 1 million votes, I think. So the combined totals of the Tory and Labour Party were already quite low. By the way, that's why you get hung parliament in 2010. And I think this election will actually push that further down. Now, in 2010, as I've already said, they got a relatively small combined vote. Of course, it was still more than 60%. It was 84% in 2017, for instance. They got a relatively small combined vote because of the Liberal Democrats. This time around, it's somewhat different, Michael, because you have, yes, the Liberal Democrats, the SNP, but you also have the Greens polling around 6%. You have Reform generally polling around somewhere between 10 and 15%, maybe higher. And you have lots of independents, by the way, who may all lose. They may all lose. And they're not just on the left. There's many on the right too, but they're going to do very well in second and third places. So I think we're looking at really the end of the party duopoly in this country. Now, in 5 to 10 years, it might work itself out again. And we might just have the two parties come back, right? Or we might have Reform replace the Tories. But I do feel like we're going into a moment of instability, volatility, where a lot could change. I think we could come out the end of it with a different electoral system. Not after this election, because of course Labour have a massive majority, but I think you'll begin to see the beginnings of a conversation about how actually, if you get fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn in 2017, then no, you shouldn't have a majority of something like 228 seats, which, by the way, one opinion poll gave us, right? There was one poll that put Labour on 36%, equidistant between 2017 and 2019. 36%, Michael. And they got a majority of more than 220. It would be the biggest, or maybe even more than that, it would be the biggest majority in the history of British politics, bigger than 1832 and the Great Reform Act, which, by the way, the Whigs, when they got that majority, they received something like 67% of the popular vote. 67%. Now you're saying with 36%, you get a bigger majority. Crazy. So I do think we're going into actually a really extraordinary, interesting moment politically. But I suppose you're right. It's weird that there's this dissonance between how incredibly boring the Tory campaign is, how lackluster that debate is between the Tories and the Labour Party, and like I say, the reality of what's going on in the rest of the country.
I suppose, to be clear, I think this election could be really historic. Like, I think this could be one of the elections that sort of is highlighted in history books, sort of when people are talking about the reconfiguration of British politics. Could be way more important than 2017 and 2019. Lots of people thought 2019 would be this sort of enormous reconfiguration of British politics, where the Conservatives get this sort of hegemonic position among sort of older, traditional working class voters, as well as sort of wealthier Brits, sort of the Brexit reconfiguration of British politics. And people thought, that could be one that goes down in the history books. Obviously, the effects of that seem to be somewhat short-lived. This does seem like it could be more significant, but there is this strange sort of juxtaposition of a very, I think it has been it's been a dull campaign when you think of sort of the debates, the interviews. Whenever you see Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak, you know what they're going to say beforehand. There are very few surprises when it comes to one of the interviews. The manifestos are all fairly thin. The policy debate, I think, is completely barren, but the outcome could be completely historic. We should also, the 4 Green MPs, that could, if we get 4 Green MPs, that could also be historic. That really would be significant when it comes to sort of the end of a 2-party duopoly. So in a way, I'm really looking forward to the results of this election, but I'm a little bit tired of the campaign, which is a great reason for you to tune into our election sesh. It's going to be our biggest stream ever. And when those exit polls come in at 10 p.m, I think we are going to have so much to talk about when it comes to the future of British politics. We're not going to be able to sort of get that from the Labour manifesto or the Conservative manifesto, but in terms of the makeup of Parliament, party allegiance is sort of completely collapsing. It could be very, very significant. Let's go to an election which seems actually like it could be both historic and does seem to be sort of very interesting in the day-to-day campaigning, because you've got big parties offering very different things. Of course, I'm talking about the elections currently taking place in France. There was a big deadline today, so parties had until 6 p.m. to decide whether they were going to withdraw candidates going into the second round of voting, which will take place this Sunday. Now, there had been calls for both centrists and left-wingers to withdraw from seats if they had come in third in the first round. That was to give the other party, the party who came in second or first, a free run to try and keep out the far right, Le Pen's party, the National Rally. So that deadline has just passed in the last hour or so. And to get an update on how it went, I'm joined once again by Cole Stangler, journalist and author. Thank you so much for joining us again, Cole. What happened at this deadline? There were calls for sort of the left and the centre to stand down to give each other a free run against the far right. Have they sort of heeded those calls?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Michael. So the deadline, as you mentioned, just happened. We don't have the official list. We should have that pretty soon. But at this point, going by the count from Le Monde, which is the newspaper of reference in France, they've counted over 218 to be precise, candidates that have dropped out. 130 from the left, 82 from the Macronist camp. And so what that means in concrete terms is at this point, there's really only around 30, 35, we'll have to see the final total, but 30 to 35 cases in which you have candidates from the left or the center, what they call maintaining themselves. So staying in these either three-way races or four-way races that, as we know, with the kind of current balance of forces, are very favorable to the far right. So to kind of translate that a little better, I mean, the reality is that this campaign to withdraw candidates, has gone fairly successfully. I have to say, and I think that might surprise a lot of people. It happened very, very quickly, really in just the span of 2 days. But we're now moving towards a scenario in which, because of these candidate withdrawals, the likelihood of a far-right absolute majority in parliament, so 289 out of the 577 seats in the National Assembly, that becomes less likely. It's not impossible, but it's looking less and less likely simply because of math, because of this process of candidates dropping out.
I mean, this only works, doesn't it, if voters follow the lead of the political parties. So, of course, if there was a freeway debate with the centrist, the left and the far right, then it only helps keep out the far right if when you pull out the centrists, for example, those centrist voters say, we're going to vote for the left. Not if the centrists aren't here, we're going to go for the National Rally because we actually prefer them to the left. How confident can we be that sort of by these third party candidates withdrawing, or these third placed candidates withdrawing, let's say, there will be a coalescing around the anti-far right candidate?
I mean, that's a very good question, because we're in a completely unprecedented scenario. The far right has never been this strong. The National Rally has a very strong base. They know people will go out and vote for them. And, the reality, too, is that we've just, and this is why there's this kind of sentiment of whiplash that I think a lot of people are feeling. We just came out of a European election cycle in which the Macronists were constantly bashing the left, being, smearing them as anti-Semitic, as being, too obsessed with identity, of being against the police, et cetera, et cetera. And now all of a sudden they're telling voters, basically indirectly saying, it's probably better to have them over the far right, even though they're not explicitly saying that, with some exceptions. So there's this kind of sentiment of whiplash. And yes, you're right. I mean, there's no guarantee that the votes are all going to transfer over. And I think in a lot of cases, they won't. Let me give you an example of, so the interior minister in the north of France, Darmanin, you have the left-wing candidate dropping out of that race. So now you have the far right versus the sitting interior minister who loves criticizing the left, who is all about authority and kind of law and order. Do you think left-wing voters are going to go out and vote for Darmanin? Well, in that case, he might not matter. He might win anyways. But you see these kind of cases. And conversely, you can take other examples on the other hand. So the votes don't automatically transfer. But again, we get down to this question of, politics is really the art of the possible. And at a certain point, it turns into simple mathematics. I think literally it's a question of you're making certain races that are not at all competitive just slightly more competitive, making them actually competitive. The calculation is it's impossible to win races in which the RN is in front and you have a candidate from the left and the Macronists that are behind that candidate, especially if they're significantly behind. The idea is that it's impossible to win those. And so you're making it possible to have one of those candidates win if you're withdrawing. I think that's the way a lot of people view it, including on the left.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It obviously doesn't guarantee that all the votes will transfer, but you've got to a hell of a lot more of a chance of beating the National Rally after this has happened. It seems now, so sort of from the projections I'm seeing, and as you've just said, this makes it less likely the National Rally will win a majority. I think, as far as I understand, people are still expecting them to be the largest party, though. I mean, what will be the significance of that? If they're the largest party, presumably they get the first shot at forming a coalition government or a minority government.
I mean, this is the thing: is we're far less accustomed to the system of a parliamentary system than you are, and certainly in the UK, but in Germany and Italy, this is very unusual for France, which has this very strong president. We're a semi-presidential system, and you have a parliament that is historically meant to basically agree with the president, with some rare exceptions. So we're in completely uncharted territory. I think to kind of walk through some of the scenarios here. Okay, so one sort of the worst scenario for a lot of people is, of course, that absolute majority that the RN wins. That's looking less likely, not impossible, but still could happen. If you kind of go down the list here, another possibility is, okay, so the RN has what you're referring to, a plurality. And that's actually what Macron's bloc today has. They've been able to kind of put together a functioning government, what they call a relative majority, by combining their party and the center-right, the right-wing Les Républicains party. So there's some people saying, that the goal actually should prevent the RN from even winning enough seats where they can even talk about the possibility of having even a relative majority by aligning with Les Républicains. That's maybe around like 230 seats or so. So one possibility is, yes, they could potentially do a relative majority, but then they'd have to overcome opposition from their opponents on the left and on the Macronists. Is that enough to do so? Kind of unclear. Then we start moving into maybe the other scenarios, which is probably the most unlikely, having some type of kind of unity Republican, in the French sense, government of the Macronists with some of the left, with maybe what's left of the responsible mainstream right. It seems very unlikely. That's one possibility. And then the final one, which is very much in discussion now, is you end up just having a kind of technocratic caretaker government that you cobble together, that people are willing to support for a year, and then at that point, after a year, call for new elections, because under the Constitution, the president can't call for new elections, can't dissolve the National Assembly for another year. Are we moving towards that kind of scenario, a kind of Italian scenario, a caretaker, technocratic government to kind of keep France stable? Potentially. But again, I want to emphasize too, nothing is decided. We still have this vote coming up on Sunday, and that's why people are obviously encouraging, parties are encouraging their voters to come out and mobilize.
And so the other complicating factor here is, so you're going to have this sort of wrangling as to who's going to be able to become the prime minister based on which parties can ally, assuming none of them get an absolute majority. But then, of course, there's a parliament and a president, which is confusing to say a British audience. So let's imagine, for example, the National Rally do get a majority or get enough seats that they can sort of create some kind of functional agreement with the mainstream right. What can they do? What's the power of the parliament vis-a-vis the president? Or can Macron basically just veto anything that the prime minister wants, and then you have a stalemate because one can veto the other and vice versa? Or can they sort of make sweeping changes to the French economy, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question a lot of people are asking. You're right, because the fact is that the French Constitution actually doesn't explicitly address this scenario, this what we call cohabitation. It's happened 3 times before in the history of the Fifth Republic, and it's kind of something that's been, for lack of a better word, invented as we go along, or sort of recognized by the Constitution, and sort of developed certain practices as things have gone along. But the reality is the government, according to the French Constitution, so the government formed from the legislature has a certain number of responsibilities, from the National Assembly. And if you look at the practice of what cohabitation looks like, going back to Mitterrand on 2 occasions and Chirac on 1 occasion with the left, you have a president that tends to take the lead on certain foreign policy questions. So obviously representing the nation, going to meetings. And that was an arrangement that and then allowing the the prime minister have a government that tended to domestic affairs. That was an arrangement that was accepted by the parties at the time. But again, you start talking about bringing in a party like the National Rally into government, and these sort of norms that are not explicitly, in some cases, recognized, those norms seem less, more fragile. And so you've already had some kind of tensions brewing over the RN, suggesting that, Macron could just become the kind of chief of the armies, a kind of figurehead president who goes to these meetings, the G7, et cetera. But really, at the end of the day, we're the ones who control foreign policy and defense. So, some of these questions are not so clear, but I think it's fair to say, in any case, when you have a national government formed, let's say in this hypothetical scenario you outlined of the far right and the right, that government could make indeed significant changes on economic policy. They'd have a minister, the Minister of Finances. They'd have a Minister of the Interior. These are posts that have come with a lot of power. The Justice Ministry. So absolutely, they can make significant changes. I think that the biggest question is when we get into foreign policy, and even then, these again, it's subject to what would this look like in practice, because the Constitution itself is not necessarily built for this, and the French system is not built to accommodate a president and a extremely hostile national government that wants to have more control. So, we're again, I know I'm repeating myself, but it's unprecedented, uncharted, whatever words you want to use. We'll have to see what happens.
And just very briefly, just one last thing, a sense of sort of how this campaign is being fought is all the sort of conversation about these constitutional questions. What happens if this person pulls out? What happens if there's a majority or a minority government, cohabitation, et cetera, or is there also sort of issues coming to the core? Is there a big debate about taxation or migration or anything? Is there a big policy debate at the moment in France or not?
I think not really since the elections on Sunday. I think the last 2 days, so Monday and Tuesday, have been absolutely dominated by these questions of who's going to drop out of the race, who not. That's dominated the conversation. I suspect, we have a few more days here where, there probably will be a debate at some point, and that could be another opportunity to actually talk about the underlying issues. So, at that point, we'll, potentially hear more about this question of immigration has been getting a lot of attention given the far right, given their power and influence. The economic questions have gotten a lot of attention. The left has been able to, I think, make a strong case when they talk about these economic questions of reinvesting in public services, raising the minimum wage. But I think one last thing quickly, if I can just highlight, Michael, is the left is endorsing the strategy of withdrawing, as are the Macronists. But, I was just speaking with someone today from the socialists who raised a point that I think everyone is thinking, which is, the risk of doing this, even if it's worth it, even if it's worth blocking the far right from winning government right now, but the risk of sort of effectively dealing with the Macronists and the left together to withdraw the power of the far right, is that not going to further, and at the end of the day, further this idea that, everyone's in cahoots against the National Rally. They're the only anti-establishment party that wants to stick up for people against the kind of political elites who are sitting in back rooms, dealing, making all these sketchy deals. That's the kind of fear a lot of people are having. And so they're saying, even if we get this, if we prevent them from winning government now, what does this mean a couple of years down the line when they're going to be able to point to this and say, look at the left and Macronists kind of in bed trying to block us from winning? I think that is quite frightening for a lot of people, but at the same time, they'll say, this is necessary. You have to block them from winning power.
Carl Stangler, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Carl Stangler's latest book is called Paris is Not Dead, Surviving Gentrification in the City of Light. So you can check that out, published by New Press. It's long been accepted wisdom that older people vote right, younger people vote left, at least for a couple of decades or so. That now is a story which is being complicated. So we can start by looking at polling in France. So in France, a full third of 18 to 24-year-olds have told pollsters they're backing the far-right Rassemblement Nationale. Now, that's less than the 48% supporting the left bloc, but it's, of course, not insignificant. Among 25 to 34-year-olds, 32% support the National Rally. So a third of younger age groups supporting the far right. It's the centrists who are really losing out among those demographics. New polling also suggests that the right-wing bug is spreading to British Zoomers. So JL Partners, they're a pollster who've released new data on the political preferences of 16 to 17-year-olds. Now, they did this in part because Labour have pledged to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. So it's suddenly a question which seems more relevant. In the poll, Labour comes first with 39% support. Reform UK are second with 23%. The Greens come in third with 18%. And the Tories are way down on 5% of the vote. Another thing that's very interesting about this poll is the gender divide, and it is absolutely massive. So as you can see here, among 16 to 17-year-old men, Labour and Reform are in fact tied in first place on 35%. Now, among women, Reform much less popular. So 16 to 17-year-old women, 43% backing Labour, 12% Reform. But it's this gap among the Greens, or in support for the Greens, which is just absolutely ginormous. So apparently, according to this polling, Greens get the support of only 2% of men between 16 and 17, and they get 33%, also a full third, of support from 16 to 17-year-old women. Now, of course, we shouldn't take this polling as gospel. So it is from a proper pollster. It is sort of, weighted and is supposed to be a representative sample, but it is only 200 people who were polled online. So I wouldn't necessarily take at face value that only 2% of men between 16 and 17-year-olds support the Greens, while a full third of women in that age group support the Greens. There's going to be a big margin of error. But I think where those differences are big, you probably can take from that a significantly larger proportion of young women support the Greens than do young men, and vice versa for Reform. I do think this is interesting. It also accords with a conversation that my colleague Aaron Bastani had with a group of teenagers when he was out doing Vox Pops in Chichester.
There's too many foreigners.
Immigrants are jarring.
There we go, what he said.
What's that?
Immigrants are jarring.
What does that mean, jarring?
Annoying. Send them back. You have homeless English people not getting housed, but you have immigrants that come here. They're illegal and they get housed. It's a joke.
Yeah. So just illegal. You're saying just illegal.
Illegal immigrants.
But legal. I'm talking about. I just asked that. Just about legal migrants.
Yeah, but even if they're legal immigrants, they still shouldn't be put over English people. No, shouldn't. We spend too much tax money on immigrants, and I think that's a joke. And we should worry about our own people before others.
And do you think the political class generally are doing that then?
No. I think the Conservative Party is an absolute joke, and young people in this country don't have a voice, and it makes me sick.
And what? So if you could vote, lads, who would you vote for?
Who would I vote for? Yeah. Reform UK, probably.
Yeah, that's the one. Reform UK. Yes, mate. Yes. We get rid of that Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister. Get rid of him.
Water mug.
Yes.
So the media would say that people that vote Reform UK, older, boomers, racists.
It's Reform UK though.
But hold on one sec. But we've got a young guy, mixed heritage, who's saying Reform UK. So what are those people wrong about? What attracts you to Reform UK?
Reform UK is that, if you're an actual English citizen, you actually have a voice in what happens in this country. But then with a Conservative Party, we don't ever get a voice. So Conservatives, just rich people doing what they want to make the most money that they can, which has always been for ages. But Reform UK, actual working class English people have a voice in what happens in the country.
Aaron, when you shared that video, you got a fair amount of flack, I think, both from sort of left-wingers saying, why are you boosting this lie that young people support Reform? And then also from right-wingers saying, Aaron Bastani is completely shocked to learn that not all young people agree with him. I thought you seemed to be just asking questions in good faith, but there we are. I'm a stan of yours, so of course I would say that. Talk about this issue, though. I think it is quite surprising to many people that it does seem to be the case that the far right are by no means the most popular sort of political grouping, or the populist right among young people, but they're also not enjoying insignificant support. What's going on here?
Yeah, the response to it was very amusing to me. I mean, today, Matthew Goodwin has platformed a unnamed anonymous Zoomer to call me out. I mean, you just watched the video yourself. I think when he said, I'm voting reform, I think I chuckled, but apparently I was shocked, you know? And I say, the media would say this, but apparently those are my opinions. When I'm trying to list shibboleths and caricatures and stereotypes held by other people, it apparently means I'm saying it. I was interested in who he was going to vote for because he was volunteering these views around immigration and so on. So I presumed he was going to say reform, but I was curious. Hence, it took 2 or 3 questions to get there, but he said reform. Apparently, again, I was humiliated. So actually, guys, this is just what journalism looks like. It's not, you ask a question, you listen, you ask another question. It's really not that hard. I know it's quite rare these days, but it's really not that hard. On the point of Zoomers, you know, if you look at the data from 18 to 24-year-olds, this is not showing up. But actually, again, in my experience, it's people below 18, and of course, they can't vote. So to that extent, it's insignificant for this election. But it's particularly amongst younger boys or young men. We saw it there in that clip, but it's something I've personally come across many, many times. Elsewhere in that video we make in Chichester, I speak to a young woman, sixth former. And she says that basically it's because everybody is getting their political opinions from TikTok. You have to remember, of course, TikTok for Gen Z is search. Nigel Farage's TikTok profile, his account has more followers than Labour and the Tories put together. So you put all that together and you look at that polling. You're right to say, of course, it's a small sample. It's only a couple of hundred people. But there's a very strong hypothesis there, isn't there? And of course, that requires further research. Nobody's saying this is conclusive evidence, but it's very strong anecdotal and initial quantitative evidence that actually young men are attracted to reform. Now, this shouldn't be much of a surprise in a way. Young men have always been happy to get a rise out of people. And Nigel Farage is very much the banter candidate. I think his best achieving, his sort of, his best performing rather, TikTok post is looking at a pair of melons saying, lovely pair of melons. You know, a 16-year-old boy will find that funny. You don't need to read too much into those things, but I think it's the savvy use of social media and the fact that, look, you can be who you want and don't listen to the people that keep on telling you off. It's probably very alluring to young men. But the really interesting point for me, Michael, is again, off this small data, it's not conclusive, but it's interesting, is the breakdown between men and women. And the fact that young women are seemingly so prone to voting Green, young men aren't. In a way, that shouldn't surprise us. You know, much of the policy offer of the contemporary left is very female coded. Now, it shouldn't be. You know, I support, for instance, socialised childcare, right? Socialised elderly care. But a young man isn't going to be thinking about that, even though they may benefit from those policies inordinately. I mean, I know I would if we had socialised childcare as that of a 7-month-old baby. But those aren't necessarily things that are coded to a young guy as male coded about what's in my rational self-interest. And in a way, actually, given they're not even working, they're not in the labour market, you know, the question is, well, what would? So I don't want to read too much into it, but I do think it does one thing, Michael, which is that it undermines this presumption that all young people are left-wing, because they aren't. Millennials are very left-wing. Much of Gen Z is very left-wing because of the economic and political circumstances within which we have become adults. You know, I graduated in 2007. A few months after I finished my degree, you have the collapse of the global financial system. I was doing my master's in 2008. That's when you had, you know, AIG socialized. You saw the year after that, 2009, the biggest economic global downturn since the 1920s in peacetime. So it's not that surprising that people who entered the labour market became adults during that moment. And in the ensuing quote unquote long recession where living standards have flatlined, it's not surprising that people are more left wing. But I do think it's important to say, well, that's not an iron law of politics. We could move into another stage of low growth, stagnating living standards where actually young people respond in a different way. That hasn't happened yet, but we could be seeing the sort of first glimpses of it. Now, in France, this is a longer term trend. And I do think it's important to say that if France had a proportional representation system, Le Pen would be nowhere near power. Right now, just picking up on the last conversation, you'd be seeing some kind of power sharing arrangement between the centre and the left in France's legislature. That's why I back PR. It's one of the reasons why. Le Pen, strangely, is excelling because of the majoritarian system that France has. Not entirely dissimilar to what we have here. Different, but not entirely dissimilar. So that trend in Europe is slightly older. Italy, you see it. The Netherlands, you see it. It's actually younger people who are more likely to vote for the far right than older people. But it would be very new and unprecedented if we see that here in the UK, if we see it in the US. Millennials, as that great piece of data from the Financial Times showed, 6 months ago, a year ago, millennials haven't just not become more right-wing as we've gotten older, we've actually become more left-wing, which again, as a cohort, is unprecedented in a century. But I do think that this nexus of social media, stagnating living standards, and perhaps a pushback against the values of the 2010s, woke politics, identity politics, I think there's a great deal of important stuff to take from all of that. I don't agree with all of it, but it's a great deal of stuff I do agree with there. That very much became the sort of hegemonic liberal way of doing politics, and young people, they like to rebel. So I do think it's a bit of all of that, pushing back against the politics of the 2010s, the continuation of decades of really economic stagnation, 15, 20 years now, and the new media stuff. But what I would say is, Michael, finally, society's getting older, and actually whatever Zoomers think doesn't really matter that much. And I hate to tell this to young people, but it's just true. There's a great statistic. In 1950, there were 17 children for every person, I think it's every under 10s, 17 children for every person over the age of 80 in Italy. Today, the ratio is about 1 to 1. Okay. So this idea, this cultural inheritance that we have, really from the 60s, that youth movements change society, I just don't think that's the world we're living in anymore. So, of course, it's of sociological interest if young people are going this way or that. And I think, inarguably, 18 to 24-year-olds are very much going left, as are millennials, inarguably. But the idea that, 16-year-olds are saying this, therefore that's the future of politics, that's not the world we live in anymore because of longer life expectancy and falling fertility rates.
Yeah, I think you're right electorally. I think it could be very interesting sort of in terms of certain cultural institutions. I suppose I'm thinking particularly about universities, although we don't really know how this demographic breaks down in terms of who will be going to university. Less than half the population do. But I do think there are many institutions where it's sort of assumed that sort of students, for example, will be very left-wing. I think universities, it's the right to say it, but I think it is somewhat true in many departments that universities are very left-wing places. And I do wonder sort of what will happen if you've got lots of sort of kind of left-wing courses, left-wing professors, and then you've got a few, a not insignificant number of quite right-wing Zoomers sort of entering those classes. I think it could create an interesting dynamic potentially. Keir Starmer is a fan of repetition. Over and over again, we hear that he is a man who leads a changed Labour Party, that he wants to end years of Tory chaos, and, of course, that his dad was a toolmaker. But there's another line Keir Starmer likes to repeat. It's this.
The first thing I do is return politics to service. Service isn't just a word.
The most important change, which will happen straight away, is about how we do politics and returning politics to service.
Return politics to public service. What we seek, humbly, is the opportunity to change our country and put it back in the service of working people. Politics has to be about service.
So politics has to be about service. It's a smart line, right? When people think about the Tory government we've had, especially for the past 5 years, they think of very self-serving individuals. Obviously, this is sort of most epitomised by Boris Johnson and Partygate, but you can also see it in Rishi Sunak as well, sort of paying to get the electricity sort of upgraded in his constituency purely so he can get a heated swimming pool. These seem like a bunch of people who are out for themselves. You can see why Labour, Keir Starmer, someone who's worked in public service for a very long time, wants to say, I'm a serious guy. I'm not in it for myself. I'm in it for you. So far, so good. It's less clear, though, whether Keir Starmer actually practices what he preaches. This is the headline from the Financial Times. The Labour leader has accepted £76,000 worth of freebies, including tickets to over 20 football games. So we can go through some of these benefits. The biggest benefit or gift he got was £16,200 worth of work clothing from the Labour peer Wahid Ali. He's the former chair of ASOS. Ali also gifted Starmer nearly £2,500 worth of glasses. That's a lot of glasses, or a couple of very expensive pairs of glasses, I suppose. Starmer has also used his position to get lots of free tickets to football. So a variety of donors paid for Starmer to see Arsenal play at least 9 times and to attend the Euro 2021 finals. And he's also gone to concerts at donors' expense. Last year, Starmer accepted 4 hospitality tickets to see Coldplay in Manchester. They were worth a combined £700, plus a £937 hotel stay. Now, that was paid for by the entrepreneur Matthew Moulding. Also on the list of tickets that Starmer has received: to go to Adele, to go to the Commonwealth Games, a Saracens rugby match, 2 tickets for the Wimbledon Royal Box, 4 tickets to see Nye at the Royal Theatre, and a £4,500 getaway on the Gower Peninsula. I think that one was for his whole family. According to the Financial Times, this makes him the biggest receiver of donations for sort of entertainment purposes. So there were people in Parliament who've received larger donations in kind. In fact, Jeremy Corbyn received £600,000, but that was to pay for legal costs. I think vis-a-vis journalists or the Labour Party itself, I can't quite remember precisely what that was for. But when it comes to sort of taking tickets for going out and having a good time, there is no one who accepts more gifts than Keir Starmer. And this is especially the case when you compare him to his predecessors. So in his entire time as Labour leader, Corbyn only accepted one gift. It was worth £476, or one benefit worth £476. Now, that was a ticket to Glastonbury where, as I'm sure you'll remember, he was speaking on the pyramid stage, right? So it wasn't just to have a good time. He was there to do a bit of work. Ed Miliband, for his part, only received a few tickets to the London Olympic and Paralympic Games. He said there was no face value on them. So he accepted those tickets. Of course, I do think, in certain situations, if you want to be the next prime minister, you want to be pictured, right, at the Euro 2021 final, because it makes you seem like you're sort of part of the culture. You could clearly reimburse the money for those tickets, though, especially if you're a relatively wealthy person. And you can't make the same argument about going to see Coldplay. Keir Starmer has defended all of this. He says, nothing to see here. He says everybody can see who donated, what it was for, and how much it is, so you can ensure there's no conflict of interest, as I would ensure there's no conflict of interest. Aaron, what do you make of this? There was a similar story actually in Open Democracy, which we covered about a year ago. Just some updates here from the Financial Times. But it does seem odd, doesn't it, that, Keir Starmer, presumably a relatively wealthy man, he's had very well-paid jobs his entire career. He's now also got a very well-paid job. You get paid very well as the leader of the opposition. It's seen as quite normal for sort of politicians to accept gifts for international travel if they need to sort of go meet different people, go to conferences. But to be accepting so many gifts to just have a good night out, albeit with his family or whoever, I don't know, it does seem, if you want to put yourself forward as Mr. Squeaky Clean, why can't you just pay for your own tickets to go to Coldplay?
Because the truth is whatever Keir Starmer says, Michael. I love that response he had, which is, well, obviously there's no conflict of interest. If there was, I wouldn't have done it. I mean, is that how it works? That the conflict of interest only exists if Keir Starmer concedes there's a conflict of interest. The tickets bought for him by Matthew Moulding, who, by the way, backed the Conservative Party in 2015. These people don't give things away for nothing. He has a business worth hundreds of millions, I think more than £1 billion. They are not giving those tickets away for nothing. Okay, you don't get something for nothing. I mean, again, that is something that a semi-literate Iranian goat herder understands, Michael. But for some reason, much of the political and media class, moreover the media class, I know this is reported in the FT, but many people have no problem with this. Keir Starmer has no problem with it. They think this is totally fine, And we keep on hearing from Keir Starmer, there's no magic money tree. We can't just do free stuff, I'm afraid. But when it comes to BlackRock saying that they'll help build infrastructure projects, there's free money. he's found the magic money tree. It's investment funds, asset managers, and it's not free, of course. It's PFI Mark II. And then in his own personal life, again, there's free money. It just keeps on turning up. What can I do? Why are they giving these things to you, Keir? It's because they're trying to build a relationship with you, which will be useful to them. Now, it's not illegal. It's very normal. Not this normal, not this many free tickets and things to go to, but it's normal. But the point is, if you're trying to pose yourself as this, like you say, squeaky clean political figure who cannot be bought, it seems rather unwise. Ed Miliband didn't take anything. There was just the Olympics tickets. So the idea that this is normal for a Labour leader to be taking this volume of free stuff is simply not the case. And as you've said, he is a wealthy man. He's a wealthy person. He was a very wealthy person. He was a very successful lawyer for a very long time. He was doing stuff with Carter Ruck, I believe, Michael. He was working as a lawyer. He had a second job. It was very few hours, but very well paid, so lots of money, whilst also being an MP. That's another thing he now rails against. He did it himself. So it's one to keep an eye on. Fantastic that the FT are reporting on it. Of course, on this kind of stuff, just with like the second jobs, just like with being landlords, the Tories are generally much worse. But by Labour standards, Michael, Keir Starmer is pretty bad. And I do think this kind of story gives an insight into how he may govern. The fact that his answer is there's no conflict of interest because you can see and it's transparent, and I say there's no conflict of interest. Well, I find that rather strange. A high net worth individual who's previously backed the Tories, who clearly wants to influence public policy in this country, I don't think a Labour leader should be taking money from them. People say that Keir Starmer, how could he be a Labour leader? He's a sir. How could he be a Labour leader? He's this, he's that. And people have a wide range of opinions on that, don't they? Some people agree, some people disagree. Some people say, well, it's good to have the establishment credentials. It gives you the permission to be more radical. Not that he's used it, but that's an argument you heard in 2020. I mean, that's a coherent argument, right? What's the argument for taking tens of thousands of pounds worth of freebies? What's the political upside here? I don't think there is one. I just think he likes the free stuff.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's no argument other than he likes the free stuff. And I suppose it does hark back to sort of what was sometimes said about Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak as well. Rishi Sunak's wife being a non-dom. Rishi Sunak will say, well, no rules were broken. There's nothing wrong with this. And people say, but is it really appropriate for the Prime Minister to have a wife who doesn't pay tax? And it's the same here. Keir Starmer's sort of explanation is basically, well, I haven't broken any rules. He hasn't broken any rules. If it's expressed publicly, then it's perfectly legal for a politician to accept all of these gifts. But it does, I can just really imagine sort of Keir Starmer being at Prime Minister's questions, as leader of the opposition and having a real go at Rishi Sunak for accepting a bunch of tickets to go see stuff from donors, right? It seems like the kind of politics he would attack, yet he's very comfortable doing it himself. And potentially this is another one of those things where people are very easy on the Labour Party at the moment because the Tories are the ones that sort of the media have decided they're going to scrutinise at the moment because they're on the way out, Labour on the way in, so they're going soft on Labour, they're going hard on the Conservatives. But we've talked many times about how Keir Starmer's sort of comfortableness or his comfort with telling lies could end up being the end of him, sort of when the media turn. I think his comfortableness with accepting benefits could also be sort of, it's one of the candidates for a potential Keir Starmer undoing, I think. Aaron Bastani, we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
My pleasure, Michael. I was going to dig out the numbers for Keir Starmer's chauffeur-driven car while Director of Public Prosecutions, but it is more than £100,000. He loves his free stuff. And yet he'll be rallying against people on various benefits and how they should get back into work. How about you stop taking the freebies and then maybe they'll listen?
Good message. Keir Starmer, I hope you're listening. I'm sure you're watching Novara Media 48 hours out from an election. You've been watching Novara Media. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back tomorrow night for our last Novara Live before Election Day.